Hello, everybody, and welcome to Champion Briefs for our February 2024 Public Forum topic analysis on the topic Resolved. The United States federal government should ban single-use plastics. My name is Thadeus Smith. I'm an assistant coach at the American Heritage School in Broward County, Florida, and I'm also a staff writer at Champion Briefs working on the Public Forum brief every month. If you like the arguments you see in this video, make sure you check out that brief. It's going to have hundreds of pages of evidence on every argument we talk about and many more. So like I said, the February 2024 topic is Resolved. The United States federal government should ban single-use plastics. And I think this is a pretty straightforward topic. So we're going to start with like definitions and framing. We're going to do some background on this issue, and then we'll talk about what I think the primary AF and primary neg arguments are going to be. So let's start with definitions. And for once, we have a topic that pretty much nothing actually needs to be defined in. It's very straightforward. The federal government is the federal government. Banning something is banning it. The only thing we want to think about here is what a single-use plastic actually is. I think the common sense definition here is a single-use plastic is a plastic item or product that's designed to be used once and then disposed of, used once and then thrown away. When we look at how governments have sort of banned single-use plastics in the past, occasionally they'll define it as plastic of a certain thickness or below. I think that that's pretty nebulous. It's difficult to figure out exactly what the right thickness would be. And teams are probably safest just assuming that this means any plastic product designed to be used once and then disposed of. So that includes the obvious things, right? Plastic grocery bags like you get at Walmart, plastic straws like you get at Starbucks, but it also includes some less thought of things. The packaging that you get chips in. Really any kind of food packaging, the vacuum sealed plastic that surrounds a slice of beef if you go to the butcher, the plastic that they seal dentists' utensils in after they sterilize them to keep them sterile. Any kind of plastic product where we rip it open, we throw it away. As far as framing goes, because this is a topic about plastics, a lot of arguments are going to deal with the environment. And so I think that we can go for a framing of existential risk here. Climate change is the most important impact because it's a threat multiplier, right? It takes other impacts and makes them worse. Climate change causes resource wars, water wars. It makes pandemics more likely to happen, more difficult to counter. And so because climate change is so big and so bad and could cause human extinction, I think teams can say that we should prioritize it over other impacts. The other strategy here is to say that because climate change primarily affects the vulnerable or marginalized groups. If you think of low-income communities or communities of color in the United States, because it affects those groups that have historically experienced some kind of marginalization or discrimination, maybe we should prioritize arguments that will reduce the impact on those groups. So two possible means of framing for you. With that out of the way, let's look at the background here. And I think there's 2 points of background we need to cover. So the first is what plastics are, and the second is how governments engage with plastics. Plastics are most well known for two things. They're well known for being incredibly prevalent in every part of life, and they're well known for being absolutely awful for the environment. And there's no getting around that second one. Plastics are bad for the environment from their moment of conception, because plastics are almost always made from fossil fuels, oil, gasoline. That's the primary feedstock that goes in to make plastics. Once they're made, they take thousands of years to break down and decompose. And that entire time, they're leaking toxic chemicals into the environment wherever they have been discarded. Oftentimes, plastic ends up in landfills. And so if it's sitting in a landfill for 1,000 years, it's leaking chemicals into the surrounding nature. You multiply that by a magnitude of millions because of how prevalent plastic is, and you have a serious health issue. And if plastics are just disposed of as litter, they're thrown on the sidewalk, or if you live in a coastal community, they make its way into the ocean. Um, they pose a threat to marine wildlife, both because of those toxic chemicals and because animals will eat them, choke, get strangled. The net result is that an animal is killed by plastic. There's no getting around that. Now, there are ways we can make better plastics, but we generally don't. So the first way we can make better plastics is through recycling them, taking one plastic item that has been used and turning it into another one. This is pretty expensive. It's pretty difficult. And unfortunately, less than 9% of all plastics that are used end up being recycled. An even smaller number of those get turned into another product. So because of the cost of recycling, this very rarely happens. The second way we can make better plastics is to quite literally make better plastics. Just because oil is the primary feedstock for plastic in the United States doesn't mean it's the only one. There are ways to make plastic from other sustainable materials, bioplastics, corn as a base, hemp as a base. But again, there's a high cost with those things. The infrastructure isn't as developed. Some of them carry their own like unique health issues. And as a result, especially because of the cost, that's just not widespread. The vast majority of plastic is fossil fuel based. And I don't think teams are going to be able to get around that. I think that plastics are bad for the environment. And while teams might be able to argue that plastics are less bad for the environment than something else, you're probably not going to be able to argue that they're a net good. So the second piece of background we want to look at is historic government action. Over the last 20 years, governments around the world have made an effort to reduce the use of single-use plastics in some way. The most common way that they do that is through a ban, either on plastic grocery bags or plastic straws. Oftentimes, those bans have started as a tax. Ireland has had a tax since 2002 that's led to a 90% reduction in plastic grocery bags. Other times, they start as a tax and become a ban. China created a tax in 2008, leading to a full ban in 2022. Maybe the most ambitious country to move against single-use plastics was Canada. In 2022, they banned 6 categories of single-use plastics in a sweeping piece of legislation, but that was then overturned by their Supreme Court, November of 2023, who said that the government didn't have the authority to categorize as many things as it did as hazardous materials. Looking domestically in the United States, as with most things, it's a mixed bag. Right now, there are 9 states that have instituted a plastic bag or plastic straw ban of some kind. That includes the entire West Coast. It includes Maine, some other smaller states, along with a wide variety of municipalities. Many states have cities or counties that have instituted bans of their own. On the flip side, several states, including my own state of Florida, Arizona, some others, have passed a preemptive ban the ban law that says local entities cannot ban single-use plastics in our state. So while some states have instituted a ban on single-use plastics, other states have said, no, you cannot ban single-use plastics in our state. And I think that's all the background we need. The big takeaway here, plastics are bad, and people are very mixed on how we handle plastics. So with that, let's move on and look at what I think some of the big affirmative arguments are going to be. And the biggest one here is climate change. This is a really simple link chain. Okay, plastics generate a lot of emissions during their life cycle, from creation to transport to like the destruction of them. And if we ban them, that will reduce emissions because we're not creating as many plastics. When you look at the statistics, single-use plastics are a sizable amount of the plastics that are created. And teams can argue that the emissions from plastics are worse than the emissions from other things because for single-use plastics, it's a continual emission cost. Walmart doesn't order plastic grocery bags one time and then never again. They have to reorder them probably every week, every few days. That means that more plastic grocery bags are continually being made, continually being shipped, transported to stores across the country. The impact of that is a high amount of emissions entering the atmosphere. So, first argument on the AF, I think, is going to have to do with climate change. The second AF argument also has to do with the environment, but it takes a different approach. The second AF argument is marine wildlife. Most plastic doesn't get recycled. Something like 91% of plastic is burned or ends up in a landfill. Many of the ones that are recycled end up in landfills anyway. They're sorted out or they're not turned into something new. And oftentimes, these landfills are close to bodies of water. They're close to the coast, they're close to rivers, or when plastic is thrown away, it just gets out and it makes its way into the river and the ocean anyway. That's bad because marine animals are attracted to plastic. If you're a fish or you're a turtle and you see a plastic bag snaking its way down, you mistake it for a jellyfish, you mistake it for an animal, you try to eat it, and you choke on it, you choke to death, or you are strangled on it, or it is waterlogged and becomes sharp and pierces your intestines. And there are studies that attribute an incredible amount of animal deaths every year to plastic pollutions. That includes in a lot of endangered species like endangered birds. It includes turtles, and it also includes things like whales, who are incredibly important to the food chain and who are incredibly important to stopping climate change because they hold a lot of carbon in their bodies. And so AF teams can argue, we get rid of single-use plastics, we end that effect, and reusable alternatives won't be as bad for this because paper is just going to break apart. A cotton bag is going to sink very quickly, or more likely just be reused and not end up in the ocean in the first place. So that's the second AF argument. Third AF argument is microplastics. And this is sort of an environmental impact and sort of a human health impact. Because we have a lot of single-use plastics, those plastics lead to a lot of microplastics. A microplastic is essentially a tiny piece of particulate matter that is made up of plastic and is small enough to be breathed in or ingested or enter the bloodstream. And there have been a lot of studies as to how prevalent microplastics are in the United States and how prevalent they are around the world. And those studies have found that pretty much everybody and everything is filled with microplastics. And those microplastics can potentially be bad for human health. They've been linked to all sorts of nasty things, cancers, other things, but they're also bad for animals. And some studies have found that there's a disease called plasticosis that's literally caused by plastic that affects animals. The fourth AF argument is about structural violence. The fourth AF argument is about structural violence. There are a few ways that teams can frame this. The impact of climate change on communities is often most felt by vulnerable people who maybe don't have access to air conditioning or things like that. But when it comes to plastics specifically, there's evidence that plastic refineries are more common, are placed in areas that are lower income, that are majority Black in the United States. Those places then have higher cancer rates as a result of the increased pollution. And so we can argue that shutting down single-use plastics, shutting down some of these refineries is going to be a net benefit to those communities. And again, if you think about framing with structural violence at the top, this can be a very powerful argument. We say that we have an obligation to help these communities, and so we should ban single-use plastics. And I think that's it for the main affirmative arguments. So I want to look at neg now. And neg has a little bit less variety, I think. The first big negative argument here is that reusable alternatives are just not good. That's because most reusable alternatives require more emissions during the production process to actually create them. Paper requires more emissions. Cotton bags require more emissions. Metal requires more emissions and has other negative environmental effects. And because of that, maybe plastics are better. In order for a reusable alternative to be good, it has to be reused enough to offset the emissions. For a paper bag, it has to be reused 4 times. For a cotton bag, it's like 137 times that it has to be reused. And odds are most of these things are not being reused that much. On the flip side, something like a plastic grocery bag is probably going to be reused as a bin liner, so it's going to see multiple uses. So that's the first way we can take that argument. We say the alternatives aren't bad because they just require more emissions. They're worse for the environment and the production. Second way we can spin this is that there are some specific instances where a plastic is maybe the only option. In medical environments, plastic is used because it's sterile. They can sterilize equipment and seal it in plastic. They can use plastic for syringes, for lines, etc. And it might pose a serious cost to switch over to some kind of reusable alternative. Maybe that reusable alternative doesn't exist. Another instance of this is with food, vacuum sealing beef, for example, to keep it shelf stable. You can't really vacuum seal paper, so maybe we don't have another option. The second negative argument, I think, is going to circle around the economic impact of a big ban. Obviously, small businesses are less likely to be able to absorb the higher cost of switching to reusable alternatives. Another possible link here is hospitals. So we just talked about how the medical industry uses plastics everywhere. Now, rural hospitals in the United States, like the Midwest, for example, are struggling in the status quo. They have low profit margins. And if they can't afford a big shift to something that's not plastic, maybe they shut down, and maybe that puts a lot of people without access to healthcare. The other possible link here is the plastics industry itself. Single-use plastics makes up a large amount of the jobs in the United States. If we switch, many of those jobs are probably going to be lost because we're not going to be producing as much plastics to keep that many people employed. Third possible negative argument here is going to be innovation. Because this topic isn't specific to what type of plastic, it just says all single-use plastics. That could include bioplastics. It could include healthy plastics that are under development, more sustainable alternatives, which could essentially crush innovation. It means we don't get those reusable alternatives. Because you see a decline in employment, the plastics industry isn't making as much money. They're not investing as heavily in those alternatives. And if we circle back, we're stuck with reusable alternatives that are not as not as good, but are net worse for the environment because they take more emissions to produce. And then the final negative argument, I think, is going to have to do with politics. It's an election year in the United States. It's 2024. Biden is running, Trump is running. They're probably going to meet each other in the general election. And plastic bans are not super popular. People like grocery bags. They don't like being inconvenienced and having to have, remember to take their reusable bags to the store. At a time when Biden is already slipping and, key swing states, any negative policy impact is going to be felt in the polls. And maybe we see a Trump election. And from a Trump election, we can pull whatever negative impact we want, right? Bad for democracy, bad for immigration or healthcare or the environment. So I think that's the fourth big negative argument here, that it's bad for politics or it's bad, ruins Biden's chances of re-election. So looking back over that, like I said, this is a straightforward topic. The affirmative arguments are going to circle very heavily around the environment. Negative arguments are probably going to touch on plastics being better for the environment than other things, or they're going to deal with things in economic terms. If you like this topic analysis, make sure to check out this month's champion briefs. Like I said, hundreds of pages of evidence on all these arguments and many more, along with responses to those arguments. And have fun researching, and good luck this month.